What is your experience or non-experience with noise? Because you've seen me perform. And what would your reference points be for that, I guess?
Yeah, so I think the first well, no, I don't know. So actually it probably goes a little bit farther back than clipping is my like big it's this rap group, and I'm sure you know clipping, but before clipping, I think even just like conceptually, I don't know if noise artists would consider this to be a noise piece, but honestly, actually, so John Cage 433 is a noise piece in a manner of speaking, that like the music comes from the sounds that are happening in the room. And I think that's one of the things about like when music stops being music and becomes sound. And that distinction is a strange line in the sand to put, because like all sound is sound. And just like, you know, rhythm and pitch and time are things that we associate with music, but are still present in sound and noise. And even just the description of noise, of just like what, like disorganized sound, or just like sounds that happen randomly, but like there's not really like, there's no such thing as like random sound. Like sound is always happening for a reason. But then, yeah, I think like conceptually that was where like the seeds were sown. But then, yeah, I forget what year it was. It must have been like 2017 or 2018 that Metro Music Fest. So ACM used to put on this like big festival in OKC called Metro Music Fest, and they would have a whole bunch of bands that, you know, is pretty much just like any local bands and mostly like ACM centered bands, because like these students had their own bands or whatever it is. But they would also bring in artists from all over the country. And I mean, since it's ACM, like connections to the Flaming Lips and whoever they might be able to get. So they had gotten clipping one time, and I apologize, listeners, for continuing to bring up clipping every 5 seconds, but like Dovey Diggs and Jonathan William Hudson and Jonathan Snipes is this trio of, you know, rap and harsh noise combination. And I had like heard of clipping through there's a Song Exploder podcast, and they had been on there, and like I didn't quite like get it. It didn't quite grab me. And honestly, like the song that they used on Song Exploder like isn't even like the best representation for like how to understand clipping. But clipping was playing at Metro Music Fest, and you know, people know Dovey Diggs as Thomas Jefferson from Hamilton. So or Lafayette from Hamilton is the same character, but or the same actor. And so a friend of mine was a fan of Hamilton, was like, oh yeah, like the guy who played Jefferson in Hamilton will be here, and he has like his own group. And then
I didn't know he was part of that.
Yeah. But like, and then it just like blew my mind that like, oh my gosh, this is like so much cool just sound that just like punches you in the face, and combined with hip hop is like such a like transgressive act. And Jarvis has talked to me about it, how like Oklahoma has just like some of the worst audiences, like, but like people weren't feeling clipping in the
really?
room. And I was just like vibing out, like, this is so good. But like, I don't know, even just like the common hip hop tropes of just like call and response stuff, like with the audience, like people weren't like really feeling it. And I was just like, man, this is so like, this is such an experience. And that kind of really drew me in to what you can do with noise.
Yeah.
And then even more so once I started my master's in music composition, I don't know, I was like exposed to so much music that like melody and harmony and rhythm had become like so tired for me. And I'm like, I get it. Like, I know what's happening here. And like, yeah, there's interesting stuff that like can be done and really advanced things that you can do to an extent. And there's just like extended harmony and jazz and metric modulation and all this sort of stuff that like is specifically in music. But like something that academic music doesn't necessarily focus on enough is just sound, and where sound becomes music and where music becomes noise and that sort of thing, is that like these are no longer pitches but they're frequencies, and the sort of effects that this has on just the physical atmosphere to have things happening in the air that aren't just a right or wrong note based on our 12 tone equal temperament system. Is that like, while I was working on a whole bunch of like academic music during my master's, I kind of like got tired of like tonal music or just like normal music. And then, like noise is so much more of like what can be explored in here. So sorry, it was a really long answer but like,
yeah, that's cool. I didn't even know clipping played here, and I might not even have known of them at that time, but at some point heard them. So yeah, I'm familiar with kind of what they do. So I think they were kind of cool. I mean, there's been a few other things like, or a lineage maybe of that, but of like maybe introducing people to that, to like bringing in like actual like harsh noise artists to collaborate on their albums and doing their own thing with it, and being on Sub Pop. I think everything's come out on Sub Pop, so to probably exposing people to that, and whether they're into rock on Sub Pop and they hear it, or they're into hip hop and they listen because it's a hip hop group. I think they're kind of important in that way, and seem like they've been really well received by a lot of people.
Yeah. And it's also interesting that they always get compared to Death Grips.
Oh yeah.
But it like Death Grips is in some ways like kind of anti-clipping. Like clipping is so intentional with like everything that they do. Yeah. And like it's never just like noise for noise sake or like this thing for this sake. Like they're always super like, oh, this is a reference to this, which is like a greater discussion about this other thing. And like there's science fiction and literature and like Black culture and like all this sort of stuff that like feeds into the thing that is clipping. Whereas like Death Grapes is almost like the antithesis of, which is like, yeah, there's a lot to like grasp in Death Grips, but like not in the same kind of like conceptual way. Death Grapes is like in your face, just kind of pure intuition of just like what sounds and things are happening in sort of a professionally like disorganized way.
Yeah. I haven't listened to much of clipping, but and Death Grips too. I've listened to some of that. I've seen them live. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's definitely cool to see that. And like I said, it probably comes from a lineage of, going back to, I guess maybe in early hip hop things where it's very raw and direct. but definitely through the lens for me of like Public Enemy and what they did with like, just these kind of overloaded kind of collage things. And that was one thing that I always, when I was younger, I was always like, okay, I want to hear like the most extreme, which band plays the fastest or which band plays the slowest. But then it also transferred into hip hop of like who raps the fastest, or who has the weirdest music or who says the weirdest things, So I was always like looking for those extremes of who's pushing things, to other levels. So that led me down a lot of paths of, going into abstract, people rhyming abstractly or maybe not even rhyming at all, not even trying to flow to the beat, but, maybe more like a direct expression that it just kind of like flowed over the music in its own way. But I feel like, it was cool to see Death Grips and Clipping and whoever else comes along after that is kind of feeding off of those things where those worlds kind of start to meet like that. And there's other people, I guess, doing similar things, and it may not be hip hop. To hear people when they do like, maybe like dance hall music mixed with like noise or really aggressive kind of music, where those worlds kind of meet is always interesting to me to see that.
I mean, hyperpop is really doing that thing really well, where it is like, yeah, here's the like bubblegum pop kind of thing, but like, what if we just kept turning up the aspects of it all the way, and then it just becomes this like super auto-tuned, super distorted, super fast, and it's like it is pop, but like in such a mangled way that like, so I mean, I really appreciate that, artists like Charlie XCX are sort of bringing the future of sound into like what other people can experience of not just like, oh yeah, here's like a fun dancey pop number, but like here's actually like crazy distorted sounds or really unconventional ways of composition that I hope that more people have explored like noise and other stuff like that through someone like Charlie XCX,
Yeah. I think that's the cool thing is like, and it's always one of those things where there's always somebody saying like, oh, there's nothing new happening in music. And it's like, I mean, it's not true because, there's always going to be people that are going to mash two things together that shouldn't go together or take something and totally distort it, whether, it's a style or, a way of making songs or whatever, there's always those extremes of like, what what happens if I take this and just stretch it or slow it down, these forms. So I think there's still places to go and things to be done with a lot of different types of sound and music, places you can take it.
Yeah, sure. And it's also like not just the like smashing two things together, but also like getting to something that already exists through a different route. And so it's like, oh, what is, like danceable shred, for example, is something that an artist I'm really fond of, Ben Levin, had thought about for a while. He's a guitarist primarily, and he's like, what is danceable shred? And it's like, yeah, that's disco and funk. Like you sort of like tried searching for a thing where it's like, oh yeah, like I know all this like super fast guitar stuff, but I like now I just want to dance. And it's like, yeah, you like found a backwards way into like disco and funk that like, existed and came about through its own way, not necessarily through that pursuit, but like that is how you get those sounds. What, I guess, who are your like introductions into noise and
Um, I would say probably the first thing that I mean, of course, listening to like Napalm Death when I was like 13 or 14, whatever, like hearing like grindcore kind of bands, death metal things. I mean, there's always that element of like noise and distortion within that music, or they're playing so fast that it's just a blur of sound. But I think coming from that, bands that just they kept like the raw, unpolished thing of, we're not trying to make this sound professional. We're going to leave in all the feedback in between each song, and if the song crashes or turns into just a extended, like, feedback session, then that's what it is. So I think through that stuff, through metal, those extreme forms of metal at that time when I was a kid in the 90s, bands like I Hate God, who were doing like super slow things but with feedback, and specifically through Mike Williams, the singer for I Hate God. He had a column in a magazine called Metal Maniacs. And that was right about the time, I guess, when like Merzbow was kind of first being introduced in that metal world, because he had an album come out on the label Relapse, which was kind of the big underground metal label at that time. So like, seeing those advertisements for Merzbow and being like, man, what is this? They're saying this is like the most extreme form of music, so, but it was always in the reference of the metal framework of like, this is like all feedback and it's just like harsh, which it was.
Yeah. It's so metal you don't even need guitars anymore.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. But there was and so that was part of it. But then there was like this guy, Mike Williams, had a column in that magazine, Metal Maniacs, and they kind of covered extreme metal, but they also covered like shoegaze bands. So the magazine itself was kind of stood out because it was the several of the writers were women, and the editor was a woman, which for that time in like a lot of rock journalism in general, I don't think it was a big thing. But this was a magazine that I could find in Oklahoma that had articles about, all of these extreme metal bands from Europe. And like I said, they covered almost kind of pop things sometimes, and maybe even touching on dance music here and there. But they had a column that was all about like underground grindcore, 7-inch, crust noise, experimental things. So they just kind of talked about whatever. So in that column, he would talk about things like Masana, or there's another artist, KK Null, and those were all Japanese artists. But they would talk about other things going on, maybe industrial noise things. But all of that for me was part of that, like, oh, here's all this other stuff to like now search for, and it sounds extreme. Let me see what it's about. So started kind of collecting what I could at that time. But so that's kind of probably the introduction right there. Another thing at that time that probably was a big influence on that was I don't know if you know John Zorn, the sax player. He's from New York. And he maybe started out in the early 80s playing in New York City with just different jazz musicians, but kind of always maybe on the free jazz side, but also doing like composition things too in that world. But he started at some point, got into like grindcore bands as an extension of like the free jazz, like where it's like this crazy, like just playing so fast that things start to fall apart or disintegrate. You know, you lose
you
something.
back your way into a different genre by like combining something. Yeah.
So he kind of fed into that, but he had a group called Painkiller, which was him. He was playing saxophone. He had the drummer from Napalm Death, who, and then they did kind of like a free jazz kind of like noise thing. And then he had a bass player, Bill Laswell, who was also a New York guy that was into like a lot of like producing a lot of like dub and reggae and funk things, but also doing these kind of groups that were like these mutated combinations of all these, you know, different genres, but bringing back like older players like Bootsy Collins with like a metal person or something like that. So it was like these people that it was just like this mashup of things into this weird new style that was, you know, screechy and fast, but other times it could be very like bass heavy. It had like a lot of bass. So that project was a huge influence.
What was that project called?
Painkiller was the name of it. Yeah.
It's really interesting how like you get the extremes of each instrument, right? And like you can like pick an instrument and find the most extreme version of that, and like that becomes the genre, right? So it's like on guitar, like metal is like the fastest, most advanced thing that you can do. But on saxophone, it's like free jazz is the fastest, most advanced thing that you could do, or like, you know, hard bop or something like that. And then on bass, like funk is like the fastest, like hardest thing you can do on bass. And so like, it's so interesting that like on each of these, like you get all these people that are like the best of their thing, but it's because like the genres that arise from like the most challenging thing to do on those specific instruments. And so like you wouldn't get that kind of thing from a saxophone player who's trying to play in like a classical style, because it's like it only gets so extreme.
Yeah. So that was a big influence, and I think it was in the middle of all the noise things too, but it also sent me down the path of like, it led me to free jazz, because I had never really listened to much jazz up till that point. And you know, free jazz, like you were saying, it starts to border on noise sometimes, but it could be the opposite. It could be very mellow but free. You know, the structure can be very loose and experimental. But you know, it led me to those other places to appreciate jazz eventually, or more straight ahead jazz, to be like, okay, yeah, I kind of start to get this now. But it's kind of weird because I came about it from the backside. Same thing. I didn't start listening to, you know, Kind of Blue or, you know, any of those things first. I worked my way back almost in a way, because from there, eventually hearing, then you started to be, people would talk about, well, what's, you know, there's this crazy free jazz record that John Coltrane does. And then you hear that and you're like, yeah, man, that's, you know, that's crazy. It's the shit. But then, you know, then you move back from there and you see what he was doing, and, you know, you're like, wow, he was, you know, if you move on back to the 50s or whatever, and you're like, oh, this is the jazz that you kind of made fun of at some point or whatever. And, you know, but then you're like, you appreciate it. But that's kind of how I came back to that stuff, I guess, through that thing. But, yeah, that 90s period of just trying to hear every recording I could. I had a good friend I grew up with that, you know, he ended up getting into extreme metal also. So we started like collecting things at that time, where I would buy things that he didn't have and he would buy things I didn't have. So we had like this, like, you know, collection between us where we would record tapes of different things and introduce each other to different music. And, but kind of those kind of, friendships or people I knew where we shared music was pretty important, you know, for me to be exposed to different things that I might not have bought, you know, on my own or been exposed to on my own. to lead down those different paths. But yeah, I just went from there. I mean, I would go through times where I would, buy a lot of noise related things and really listen to a lot of noise and then kind of burn myself out.
Yeah.
And then be like, okay, I'm going to go back to, now I'm listening to a lot of hip hop, or whatever. And, it's just kind of moving back and forth between things.
It is something that, like, with kind of those extreme genres, that, like, is anger necessary for, like, these kinds of things? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It seems like this just extreme outpouring of emotion that, a lot of times can be anger or just like sadness or whatever it is. But I don't know what like happy noise music sounds like, or if there's like a way of describing that, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of, I think when you get to know people that do it, you see people, and it can be, I guess, have that cathartic kind of side to it, where you're pouring out an experience or an emotion into it, and that becomes kind of the push to push it over the edge. There's some other people that just enjoy that, like when you go to a show that is so loud that it's just that wall of sound, like being into the pure sound of it. There are people that they do noise in a very fun way, where it's like, the one person I guess I can think of is, Jonathan Cash, he was one of the first people I saw. Maybe, I went to a noise festival in Texas, and just kind of like, it is really harsh noise, but it's kind of like he'll throw some just absurd like sample in there, and I think he played in Tulsa and did a cover of the Cranberries or something in the middle of the noise set. So it's like it has like a goofy kind of fun thing to it where it's not taking itself serious at all, but I know that's part of it, where it's like there are the people that they're, singing about something very, messed up or whatever it is, heavy subject matter. And, that's a big part of it too. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I feel like, extreme music in general always, those emotions feed into that really easily, and maybe if you are trying to express that, that's where that goes to, is that anger. But it also, yeah, like I said, I think there's can be like sadness. There can be other emotions in there too. And the anger may not be what you think of, like, oh, I'm just mad at, this or that. It could be very focused anger of like, bands that are political, whether it's punk rock bands or, grindcore things where they take a political stance. So I feel like that is to me, that personally, it starts to be more kind of genuine, like the feeling behind it. You're like, yeah, I mean, I know they're really talking about something they believe in, when you know that they truly believe in what they're writing or what their concept is. There's that side, but I think the same thing with noise. Sometimes it's just like pure, maybe it is anger, but it's just like release. It's not really at anything in particular other than maybe the world,
Right. And it is interesting how, in any sphere, whatever, there's like a hyper sort of like intellectualized, or like, people get really uptight about like, oh no, things like have to be this way, or like, oh, they're doing it wrong, or like they're a hack or whatever, like all that sort of stuff. I feel like, in any genre whatsoever, like there are people that are like, oh, like you listen to like, oh, well, Merzbow's like baby harsh noise, like whatever it is like, yeah, well, of course you would be into that. But it's like, I don't know, like, especially in extreme genres, that like that tribalism becomes so extreme as well that I don't know, like being the type of person that like gets into these kinds of communities anyways, like we know what like it feels like to be excluded, and so we tend to become gatekeepers of that as well.
Yeah, yeah, it happens. And yeah, you kind of think of that, especially there. I feel like maybe people are more protective of what they're doing, or like you said, maybe they over intellectualize it. I think the cool thing is when you do kind of realize that there are a lot of people though that are like you said, they're coming from always being an outsider, and when they find that, um, it becomes its own community, and you kind of realize that from what I've seen, it's like, yeah, I mean, you always do have the gatekeepers or people that um, maybe they don't even fit into that scene, or they're just so maybe extreme in their beliefs that they kind of get pushed out. But I feel like overall, I mean, it's like it's something that makes people happy to be in those places and to be able to do it. Like at the Tulsa Noise Fest, or even the Noise Fest I went to in down in Texas. It was a fun time. People had fun, and you just saw a lot of like laughing, joking, whatever, people talking about music and partying. So it was kind of like I think to me when I entered that realm, because before that I had only seen like smaller noise shows, experimental shows. I hadn't really been around it, but to be in that where there's actually like a community of people, and it's like a 2-day community that all comes together. And most of it's people that know each other online mainly, and you kind of know people, but then you meet them in real life, and everybody had a good time, and it was fun, and it wasn't really any like posturing or maybe some of the things you see at like a hardcore punk show, maybe, where it's kind of more like attitude in a lot more ways. But this was kind of more like, I just kind of saw it as more like open and accepting, because it was like you could come in there and do whatever you wanted in that space, and it may not even be that noisy. Maybe you came in and did some just a weird experimental thing with like non-harsh sounds, and you kind of just wouldn't fit into the flow of what was going on. And everybody kind of was very good about giving feedback, letting they liked what you did, asking you questions. But I also feel like it was kind of a lot of times that world has that crossover with, and maybe a lot of music does, but maybe that one specifically with like more like visual artists or people coming from, they might work in a lot of other places like that. So maybe a little more openness to people and ideas, in a lot of ways. So
yeah, and it is a lot about just like open experimentation, open creation, and that like I was talking to Nicole Poole about this, that like in kind of rigid academic musical spaces, like there are so many standards that are expectations that everyone like tries to adhere to, and like what is a good sound, what is a good singer, what is a good guitarist, what is a good whatever. And so it's like there's so many expectations of what you should sound like and what in tune means and what in time means, and whereas in noise it is just like what sounds are you making at a very just like front facing level, like what is it doing to you? And there I imagine there are like noise standards per se, but like at the same time it's like we're all just kind of enjoying sound as it is.
Yeah, and like I said, you know, if you go to something like depending on the noise fest, I mean, you know, sometimes you might find some that are all very maybe specific style of that they're curating and bringing in. Tulsa Noise Fest was very open, like I said, where there were like people that were up there having fun, people that were very serious, you know, maybe confrontational or talking about very personal things that had happened to them. There was a performer called Ritual Chair, and she does these very confrontational noise pieces about subjects like sexual assault, and like, you know, very intense, but you know, it's like you can't like, if you're in that room with her, you know, you definitely feel it, and it brings up different emotions. And that was a cool thing about the festival, that it was very, you know, to me, it was like diverse enough to where I was like, yeah, man, there's a lot of different people here of, you know, different, you know, genders, non-genders, whatever, you know, I felt like it was like very diverse in that way. And, you know, people of different backgrounds, you know, people of color, to where I, you know, I was like, you know, it was cool to see that aspect of it too. But with that performance, you know, her kind of speaking to like mostly large group of men, but seeing those men like react in a way where they were kind of like, you know, how am I complicit in what she's talking about? You know, so that was kind of cool to have some things that were really heavy subject matter, some things that were just pure experimental sets. You had all different ages of people. There were bands that played, locals, people that had come from, you know, California, New York. There were people from all over the place. So it was really cool to see that, I think, and that kind of like being part of those two noise fests in Tulsa, and then the one I went to in Texas, kind of sparked me back into it, because I feel like I said, I mean, I've always been into noise, and I've different times I've just kind of like not paid attention to what was going on around, you know. There's some people I've always just kind of followed throughout the years, but never really knew the scenes. But to see that, you know, over the last few years, what it's been like, at least here in the Americas, but also like seeing things in other parts of the world, like Indonesia, you know, through Instagram mainly, you know, through those social media things. To be able to see that too is cool. To be like, oh yeah, there's this whole world going on over there that's, you know, maybe similar in a way, where it's like it was influenced by those bigger noise artists, and now it's kind of like became its own thing, you know, that feeds itself and gives space to people to do things.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of spaces, the other hard part about noise is that it is really difficult to find spaces for it to happen. And I mean, especially in places where I mean, here in Oklahoma, like there's a music scene, and we are sort of internally like really supportive of each other, but like it's harder to kind of like break it out of just ourselves, and then even harder for experimental music to find a place, and you know, just being able to do the things that we do and express ourselves in all the diverse ways that we do. But like, you know, the bars still have to sell beer, and like what kind of space you're creating for people with, you know, a rock cover band versus a, you know, 20-minute harsh noise set is very different.
Yeah. And it's, you know, it's kind of been cool to see, and I know it always ebbs and flows, but there are, some spaces that are very, and they always have been kind of supportive or different. Like I said, they are always popping up, maybe houses that have shows, or like right now, the Sanctuary, or Oscillator in Norman. We've had a couple of shows there, and they used to be involved with the Dope Chapel, which at one point that was an experimental spot in Norman. Yeah, and it's kind of been cool because the Tulsa Noise thing was done through the Tulsa Artist Fellowship. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of done in a space that was, it was like a studio space, basically. It wasn't like a bar. That was maybe the other thing about it, is that it wasn't a traditional venue. Mm-hmm. And it was funded, so it was totally free for people to go to. So anybody could walk up there if they wanted to come check it out. So it was kind of cool to have it in those kind of spaces too. And I think through my connections of my cousin Nathan and other people I know that kind of work in the art world, to kind of cross over into that and be able to do some stuff in some of the art spaces here and up in Tulsa it's been good to do that too and have that support. So there is, I mean, it's kind of like there are some spaces coming around, and whereas maybe 15 years ago, I don't know if I would have thought that it was there, but it probably was in some form. Mm-hmm. But for me, I've had some good opportunities to just put my stuff out there, and that's been really cool to have that there. So
yeah. At the same time, it's also like, as far as I know, a less saturated market. I mean, less people are trying to make harsh noise than people are trying to make rock music, and so, you can. Pun intended, you can throw a rock and hit a guitarist, but like far less so can you find a noise artist or someone that does experimental type music, or that is maybe willing to perform it, right? Because that's another part, and with the ability to make whatever kind of stuff we want to in the safety of our own homes or our own headphones, even, there isn't as much like need to perform it necessarily, because we can just like do the stuff ourselves and just like share it online, and this kind of different space, different community that doesn't necessarily have to happen in like a physical space, but people can share music with each other that exists in, I mean, there's lots of ways in which even a lot of music that I make isn't able to be performed, because like just using the computer in such a way, or using recordings in such a way that like this can only be just like press play on the recording, because that's the only way you're gonna experience it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's changed a lot of things. Performing is, I guess, when I started doing it, I was just kind of thrown into it, and had never really done any performance art per se, or been in front of people like that. I think it was something I had to like, I mean, I overcame it pretty fast, but maybe, back 20 years before that, would I have been able to do it the same? Maybe I might have been too self-conscious to do it. And then so I was pushed into it, but I immediately like dove into it, and I was just like, okay, I'm gonna, start thinking about what do I do to make, what I do interesting to watch, or bringing in visual aspects to make it have a meaning to it, or to make it have a performative, maybe not performative, but a performance side to it, that it conveys something, but it also is engaging with people, and they can, they take something from it. So that's kind of been cool to get the feedback of what when people watch me and what maybe they come tell me about what it meant to them, I guess, or what they got out of it. It's always been very different things. I think one of the other things is like noise when you see it live and you can see it where it's just like so loud that it becomes like a physical thing. It's then going and listening to a CD or or an MP3 of it isn't gonna like, it doesn't hit the same. You have to take those two things separately at that point. Not that that's not good, but or that you can't play that through the same system. But to see it live is something else, which like a lot of music is too. But I definitely feel like once you do that with noise, you're kind of like, wow, whoa, that was and maybe it makes more sense that way too. I don't know, as like a something that just kind of clears everything out of your mind or something. It just is hitting you so hard that you can't focus on anything outside of that space or that moment. And like, and I've kind of had those experiences too, and maybe with other music too, when I've heard things live and I was like, whoa, this is, intense. But there was one performance where a friend was there and she had no reference to what it was, and I was actually playing a 51st Street speakeasy at the time, and it was part of an art show, and I did a set, and we just like turned the PA up all the way, so it was like super loud, and it was just a very cheap PA, but the room was small. Yeah. And it was like, the bartender was trying to come tell me to turn it down in the middle of the set. But when I was over, I kind of wondered what she thought about it, because I knew she didn't have any, maybe wasn't like a music fan of any kind of like extreme thing at all. And she was just like, whoa, that, I feel like my chakra has been realigned or whatever from that. And it was like, it was like a cleansing or whatever. And I was like, wow, that's, it was kind of a trip to hear that, somebody say that about it. But I feel like it can be, if you just kind of, it can be something that you just like give over to, in a way. You let it, take over your ears and your mind, and not really, it becomes it's just about sound at that point. It becomes no subject matter, or, nothing else going on kind of matters at that point.
Well, it's interesting that, like, because you come from more of the art side rather than like the music side, that like the experience is crucial, right? Like, you cannot consume a sculpture through a photo of it. Like, you're experiencing it in some sort of way, but it's like filtered through like two other mediums that like make it not what the thing is. Yeah. And so, like, when you build an art installation, for example, like, you are considering just like, what is someone going to be feeling as they enter into this space physically? Yeah. As opposed to like, is someone going to be listening to this on headphones or in their car or literally in person from a PA? And those sorts of things, and like the way that it is consumed changes the art. And so, like, there are lots of ways in which noise has to be experienced, and that, like, sure, we'll have another piece of yours at the end of this one as well. But like, there is something about like, sure, if you are listening to this on just like headphones, that is an experience, and it is a separate experience if you get in your car and like turn the volume up all the way. Yeah. And that is, something else. Like, do you feel like that's a necessary part of the experience to like understand the art, at least for yours, for your art?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it is. haven't really even focused on recording as much because I'm always like focused on performances that are coming up and like what am I gonna do, planning for that or preparing sounds for that. Because to me, I mean, yeah, the recording is one thing, but I don't think that the performance like trends, definitely like setting up in my garage to record isn't the same as like, okay, I'm going into this space and I have a set of objects and I know once I start playing that I'm going to be so focused on what I'm doing that I kind of get lost in it. Whereas if I'm recording in my garage, I'll probably be more self-conscious of like, how does this sound or how is this flowing or whatever. Whereas in the live setting, I mean, I go, I have done various levels of preparation in like, okay, I'm gonna use this first, and then kind of thinking that way, like I'm gonna blend these things, and then just a plan in a way. But the time is never. Sometimes I've done time, and in the live, I've played a live duo with my friend Mateo Galindo. We've a collaborator. When we played together as a unit, we did say like, let's make this X amount of time long, and then we just came up with a plan of like, but we're gonna do it in this amount of time. But that's about the only time I've ever really worked with a specific time frame. I think it's another experiment for me to be like, okay, how do I conceptualize time as I'm playing? Because I can't ever tell. I mean, sometimes I can say, yeah, that was around this amount of time, but sometimes I think that and it's not even, might be off by like 5 minutes.
Sure.
So it's kind of been a learning process of like, how do I learn to time things or to tell how long I've been playing or is this getting boring? I don't know. Just those questions to myself with what I'm doing. But a lot of times I'll go out with a set goal or plan of like, I want to do these specific things to lead to the end. So I'm going to at least make sure I do those things. And then however long that takes, or maybe it kind of changes a little bit as it goes, but to definitely get those things done has kind of been the base of what I do. Eventually, that's kind of what it became, was like having a plan at least of what it is. I there have been a couple of times where I'm like, oh, this is just, I'm going to bring some gear and set it up. I'm not even going to think about it. Like going into it that way of like, this is like kind of the true harsh noise set where there's no intention, there's no plan. And I'm just going to do the kind of like automatic, actions and changes. Like I'm not really going to think about what it is, try to like take myself out of the equation, even though I am still in charge of it, maybe that approach where it is like truly, just noise, there's no intent behind it at all. So,
Well, I mean, yeah.
But there always is intent, no matter what you say. You can say that, but it's still that you're intentionally going to that place to do it and to be what it is. It's its own thing. So that's the intent, I guess, with it.
Yeah, and I think about just the definition I have for music is sound with intent, right? And so, like, you are doing something like effectively in a way, and this is how like one question I normally discuss with musicians is like, is there such a thing as bad music? And for me personally, it's like, it's not even so much a thing about like, objectively good or bad music, but more so about like, how well are you communicating your intent, right? Like music is communication and we're trying to say something through this endeavor. And so if you are trying to say something and your audience gets something like way off, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's like, what does that say about your endeavor that you were trying to say something and it wasn't communicated even in the slightest? And so, yeah, to have a piece where it's like, if you have video going in the background and like there are certain items that you're using in the performance, like in some ways it's not even so much about like the sounds themselves, but like what is literally going on here and what is like physically being communicated here is like as much a part of the performance as the sounds that are happening there. And if you just hear a recording, you're not getting a huge part of the intent.
And that was the show you were at, right? With the bird video in the back. Yeah. I think, hearing a recording, and the recording may be really good. And as a piece, you may be like, wow, this is cool. But at the same time, it may not be it wouldn't be as interesting, I guess I should say, as being there to see it and what's going on and all the different aspects to it. For sure, but that in the video thing is like that's like the second time I've had a video projection to play behind me. So that's something else to work into it too, is like a visual thing in that way, something else in the space. And maybe I guess relating in a way, there's a lot of times it's like there's different things kind of interweaving in the subject matter of that, because I was using these the piece you saw was it had the birds, and I was doing a piece about, there was some elements of pop music. I had this pop music sample in there also. So there was different elements that was left over from a previous piece that didn't work well. So I like carried it on into that one. There were the bells, a very specific, Pawnee, like a dance instrument type of reference, but kind of taking out of that context, it's not trying to be that, but as a pure sound source. And then the video of the birds was a reference to another piece too, where I had taken some samples of some cliff swallows and use them in something. So I guess in a way it was sampling too. It was finding a video of that and kind of changing it a little bit and using that as to play in the background. So there's kind of like there's a lot of that I feel like that happens with what I do, where like I said, there's different concepts or subject matters that kind of can come back up and kind of interweave back into the different pieces in a way. Some of them may be very specific, but I think there's always kind of a crossover. Like things are always kind of blending between sets and between pieces, like that.
Yeah. And then the other part is just like the endeavor of making it, like in specifically that one, like it's a funny thing, but like there was a cable that was like pulling and like something was getting really close to the edge of the table, like often. And it was like, that was actually part of the experience of like, is this thing going to fall? And does he want it to?
Yeah, maybe
right. Like,
yeah.
And then, how you had the box with like the metal in it and you were like pulling it. And it like, when it gets stuck on like another cable, it's like, we're in this with you. We're trying to like watch this thing happen.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely part of it. I feel like trying to come up with like I said, like I want to do these specific things, and they may happen exactly like I wanted, or I'm conceptualizing it, but they may not. I may have a problem, but you kind of gotta. Then it's like improvisation. Like, okay, how do I fix this in the middle of playing, or how does it change something?
Yeah.
that kind of reminded me a set that me and Mateo did in Tulsa. Um, he made these. He took these like milk jugs basically, and filled them with water, and then took the jug off, so they were ice, but they were in the shape of like milk jugs. But also putting like different colors in them, and then putting light behind them. And then we also had contact mics inside of them. So we used them as an instrument as we played. And we played for about 30 minutes. And this was a month or two back. And well, no, that was back in May. So it was warming up. So it was warm in the space. And I wasn't really paying attention, but I guess as we were playing, you know, the ice started to melt. Yeah. So there was this river of like melted like color slowly working its way out through the audience. And I didn't even notice it till after we were done. You know, somebody came up and said, you know, they were like, you know, man, that was cool, you know. And then like the water thing, it was like we were all having to move because it was slowly starting to come out into the crowd as y'all were playing. And you know, it wasn't intentional at all, but it was like a really cool part of the piece that was just kind of like happened on its own. And became part of it, where the crowd kind of had to all part because they didn't know what it was. They just saw this like colored liquid coming out towards them. So yeah, I think that's the thing is like I said, you know, you never know what people, how they're going to respond or how they see and interpret what you're doing, and then coming and telling you after, like maybe it made them think of something. Or, you know, they felt some emotion or something, you know, and that's cool to have that feedback.
Well, even sometimes like the like symbols SYMBOL that you use during a performance can actually kind of reinforce themselves simply by the way that they are. And so it's like, if you're trying to say something by using water in your piece, right? Yeah. But like something happens that like, oh, it melted and it like imposed itself as simply the way that it is, which is water. Yeah. And is like, you're saying even something more just by letting it be exactly what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And, so that's kind of like, you know, I feel like that's definitely the art side of it is using items that taking them out of their normal context and putting them into a different context, using them as a sound source. That's, you know, that's really the heart of it, is like that's the main thing. A lot of times is I'm wanting to use it as a sound source. You know, I could go get a random piece of metal, but I'm going to take this one that's very specific. I've been using metal from, I mean, a lot of things are all referencing Pawnee, and I went to an old family home that was built in like the 1890s and has, you know, pretty much it's all collapsed now, but it has like old rusted scrap metal pieces all in there. And I've taken some of those. So to any normal person, they may say like, oh, he's got the normal harsh noise trope of this, like, you know, twisted piece of metal. But to me, it's like, it's very specific. And it is part of the research, because I've been researching that house to try to find that history of what, you know, when did my family, who built that house, you know, what's the history of it? And I did find some stuff out about it. So to me, it's like, it's part of something. Usually if I have an item I'm using, you know, it's going to have some, and that's just one thing, but it may have a family history, or it may have a tribally specific thing. Or maybe something bigger than that, you know, or a sample, maybe like just using a pop sample of something that at work is always playing on the radio, and it became part of my everyday, you know, life, something I normally wouldn't listen to, but it turned into like one of my favorite songs over the summer. And so I was like, oh, I'm going to sample that, you know, I'm going to put that in this piece and see what it is, or where it takes it, you know? So I think that's part of it, is like a lot of that is bringing things from life into it. And maybe that makes it maybe a little more relatable to people. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that it goes to show that, like, yeah, you don't have to necessarily like spend years learning how to play an instrument if like you have a specific intent with like what you're doing, and if it's significant to you, then like that is part of the art of it. And so you don't have to study how to play the sheet metal, like, because it's not a real instrument, and it's like specifically this particular item is not an instrument that you can learn or be trained on, but like to utilize it in a thing is a whole other experience.
Yeah. And I mean, things like that you maybe use over, you learn a way to actually play it in its own way.
Yeah, yeah.
And sometimes you may only use something once, but when it's something that you've done several times, you figure something out about it, how to control it, how to make it make the sound you want. But I think that's kind of like where it continues on, like researching different instruments to kind of go in the directions of other things I want to do. Other types of music I may try to work in. I mean, I've done some things that were very just straight ahead, like techno, 4/4 kind of beats in the music, but kind of like learning that side of it, coming from that side. I mean, and the future is always wide open. I'm always like thinking like, well, I guess I could like, start learning how to play the guitar finally, or something like that. But so that's all wide open because like I listen to all that music too. Like I do listen to like all kinds of rock music still, and even like noise rock, and I'm like, that'd be awesome to try to do someday. So that's wide open. It's like you never know. Maybe I'll have a guitar next time you see me play. I don't know.
Sweet. Yeah. Warren, thank you so much for doing this with me.
Yeah, definitely. It's been great. Had a good time.
Where can people find you and your things once again?
They can find me at Realrider TickSuck Sound on Instagram. Searching Warren Realrider will bring that up. And then
I'm sure TickSuck would probably also
search that up. Yeah, any of the Google search will bring up that. There's also a link tree on Instagram with the links to all those videos you may find. Bandcamp, SoundCloud, other projects are all linked there. And some of the visual art kind of crossover things I've done. I mean, I've had a few of those things too, that kind of those opportunities popped up. So there's just definitely some documentation out there now. So
yeah, awesome. Well, once again, thank you so much. I'm Santiago Ramones.
Warren Realrider.
And then, yeah, a different piece of yours will play at the end of this as well.
Yes, yes.
This is a volume warning. Turn your volume down. Noise incoming. You can find everything that I do on my website, santiagoramones.com. I make music and produce audio. The music you're hearing now is music I made. You can listen to official releases by Santiago Ramones on Spotify, Apple Music, and the other streaming places. Or you can support me directly by buying my music on Bandcamp. I'm working on Hypothetical, my first singer-songwriter album, so if you'd like to hear that at some point, there are lots of ways to support me on my website. There's a Discord server in which we discuss deep topics from the podcast, but it's also a community of beautiful human beings. All the links to all my things are on my website, santiagoramones.com. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast. It would mean a lot to me to hear what you have to say, and it lets others know what to expect, better than I could ever explain. I want to help the world have deeper conversations, so thank you for listening to and supporting Bit Depth. I was in the podcast with my 3 things. They shape my life philosophy. Those 3 things are: love never fails, it's going to be okay, I might be wrong.